Position here.
Okay. POIs in the POIs in the chat, and then at 5, if I don't take one, just like shout out. Cool. Is everyone ready? Before we get into the constructive, I want to just note like 5 missing burdens from that last speech. One, they try to shirk their burden in this round and just be like, well, we're just going to like criticize him. Like, no, the CA clarification says not only do they have to defend pushing for prosecution, but criminal prosecution. Read the CA chat here. They can't just be like, well, we're going to do investigating. 2, they say there's no trade-off, and this is only one of many things you can talk about, but they never explain why this strategy stays consistent into the long term. Why doesn't the right make a big deal out of this, forcing you to spend more time on it, or why won't the media run with this, right? You can't look unresponsive once you throw this into the field. 3, why is it more morally important to call someone out if it stops you from other moral obligations, like helping the poor, who you also made campaign promises to, right? To the extent that we're able to prove there's a trade-off, which I'll explain later, then clearly not all your voters are the same, so you can't fulfill every single campaign promise to the like maximum extent you want if there's a trade-off, because your voter base is not homogeneous. So sure, maybe you ran on this, but it's also unclear that this was a campaign promise you made. They literally just assert this. Also, 4, if most people are against these riots, they need to determine the scale of their impact, right? Because how much more can you make people hate Bolsonaro if they're right that people think these riots were bad? And then 5, why is this a good bargaining chip? Like, if anything, they've already already blown their load here, right? You've shown your hand by pushing for criminal prosecution, the hardest thing you could ever push for, which is what they have to defend. So it's unclear why that's a bargaining chip. We keep the bullet in the revolver, better bargaining chip on our side of the house. Cool. 2 pieces of framing that take them out. First, what are the goals of this movement? Something they never talk about. We would say that it is probably generally pro-stability. That again, given that you just came out of a tumultuous election, you probably want to be elected far into the future. And you generally run on broad left-wing economic policies. Lula specifically is seen as a lot more moderate. He isn't some kind of like crazy guns tooting like crazy liberal. He's like a center leftist, right? Importantly, he frames himself as this like respectable old man who cares about the nation and respectability. He doesn't mudsling or focus on Bolsonaro. He's not like left Trump or whatever. His campaigns were broadly about Brazilian economic policies. So this just seems deeply confusing to your voter base who didn't vote on you to be the kind of person who would weaponize the criminal justice system to try to sue someone who did not directly incite things that happened. They're going to be really confused here, but also it probably does trade off with their ability to talk about other economic policies. It just shapes your image in this way. Even if you could talk about those other policies, the fact that you talked about this policy clouds the way that they view you. So it's not really about the amount of fungible time that you have here. Importantly, then, since moderates are your voter base, they're the people you don't want to alienate. They alienate them on their side of the house for reasons I'll explain later. Secondarily, on Bolsonaro, like I know opening government is some Americans, but like Bolsonaro is not Trump, and they can't just use their Trump analysis and be like Bolsonaro here, right? Bolsonaro, unlike Trump, condemned the rioters after it happened. So it's going to be pretty hard to prove that this is what he wanted. 2, he said he had respect for institutions and that he accepted the results. Sure, he said that there is a degree of corruption happening, but obviously opening government cannot overclaim that what Bolsonaro said is equivalent to saying, take your guns and run into the Capitol. If anything, they radicalize him and make him look like a martyr while making yourself look unreasonable, flipping what opening government gave you at the bottom of the PM when they were like, guys, this is like your moment. You need to like make him look weak. Like people are just gonna be like, what the fuck? This makes no sense. This doesn't make him look weak. It makes him look sympathetic. Cool. So we're going to prove 2 things in constructive. 1, they're going to lose the court case. Why? It is a criminal case as per CA clarifications. So the standard of a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt, right? Like an over 90% chance that it's likely happening, not just a preponderance of evidence. What do you need to do to prove beyond reasonable doubt? You need to prove intentionality, that when he said these things where there was like a degree of corruption that happened, that his intention behind this, the mens rea, was to tell people secretly in code to go shoot up the Capitol. Probably not something something you'll be easily able to prove. Two, the courts do not want to have more rioters. They don't want to lionize or martyrize this individual, so they're unlikely to want to vote in your favor absent overwhelming evidence that this is what happened. And it just isn't, because he didn't tell people to run up to the Capitol. In fact, the fact that he said, oh, guys, I really don't think that like you should have done that is evidence that they'll likely not prosecute him. Courts, so it's not legally direct incitement. If we prove you lose, that's terminal to their case, because it looks awful on the party. It's something you'll have to constantly justify, and therefore their no trade-off framing at the top can't work, because you will always have to be on the back foot and explain why you did such a fucked up and awful politicking strategy. It also makes it look like you politicize the court. I would say the vast majority of people in democracies feel that Supreme Courts and courts in general should be an apolitical body that is a backstop against partisan politics. You make that like look absolutely stupid when you say, you know what, we're going to use the court as a means to attack an individual who literally was not responsible as per the court's decision. This is terrible for you as a party. But even if they win the case, taking this act is still bad for you in two ways. One, in the way that it affects electoral support, I think you're much more likely to lose future elections on their side of the house. Why? On Gov, this will be perceived as incredibly slimy by the moderates, because there was a shown lack of trust in institutions. Personal attacks are often on identity, so it'll be seen as negative mudslinging, and it avoids platforming other issues that matter and brings the focus back to Bolsonaro. Furthermore, it leads to a lack of support, because social movements on their side of the house go to the right when they see him as a more trustworthy character. People who are just broadly populist but not right and move to the right on their side of the house. Before I move on, I'll take a question from closing.
So Bolsonaro's already been barred from running in the upcoming election. He just hasn't been criminally charged yet. So surely there's some pretty sound evidence on which they're basing this decision.
Wait, no, what? So first of all, even if that's true, our argument is that when you martyrize him, it makes the party as a whole look more sympathetic. Two, I think it is likely the case that Bolsonaro, even if he himself can't run, can still lionize the party and make them do other things. But three, that's just like a broad assertion. Like, I just don't think that's true. Like, you'd have to explain to me why it is that even if they barred him from running, the reason they barred him from running was because of this thing that hasn't been proven yet. If it already has been proven, then it's unclear why the gov mechanism needs to happen at all, right? Like, that just doesn't make any fucking sense. Cool. So on op, I think it is just much more likely you get support because you're seen as comparatively much more consistent and not willing to go into the mud with Bolsonaro. If you choose to go into the mud with Bolsonaro, he's already proven he's much better at the kind of dirty politicking that you will lose on that battleground. Cool. Some explicit rebuttal to some things we got out of opening government. The trade-off argument I've already beaten with the framing. Then they're going to say that Bolsonaro said it was rigged, but he didn't say to riot, and that's the burden that they need to meet, especially in a criminal case. Then they say you have to fulfill your promise to voters, but the question is which voters? We explained to you that the vast majority of your voters care a lot more about passing specific policy and doing smart politicking and not just like attacking Bolsonaro. But note that fulfilling this campaign promise is also path dependent upon proving you are able to prosecute Bolsonaro. Then they say people hated these riots. So one, if people hated these riots, then as I pointed out earlier, you're not doing much here to move the delta in terms of like how much people hate Bolsonaro. Finally, they say capitalize on the momentum. Our argument is you kill the momentum because you look really stupid, and also you don't fulfill your campaign promises to the people who voted for you. For all of these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. I guess
Diego, you're solo chilling now because Ayushi needs to move to room 1 because Elgin didn't show up.
Yeah, I was notified by the CA team for that. So Ayushi, please move to the
room 1.
Right. Thank
you. I guess we must move on, and now I would like to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Two things that knock out opening opposition's argument about why the prosecution will be unsuccessful. The first thing to point out is that, as CG correctly notes, in which OO seems to ignore, there is overwhelming evidence that Bolsonaro explicitly incited these riots. Like, literally read the news. This is in The Economist. OO is genuinely just lying about Brazil. My degree is on this topic. But secondly, gut check. Inasmuch as TSC has already voted against Bolsonaro, and Brazil has a relatively independent judicial system where the judges who work within TSC rotate out every 2 years, it is quite quite likely that there is a strong case that exists against Bolsonaro. But I'm also just going to explain why, even if this criminal prosecution would happen independently, this is better for your party's legacy. So that's why it is likely that you are going to be prosecuted. The other thing I want to add is that even if Bolsonaro didn't explicitly incite anything, he knew that there was a lot of latent momentum that exists in order to create a riot and fudge the election results. Even prior to Lula winning, Bolsonaro literally said, if Lula wins, the election is by default rigged and we're going to devolve into a socialist hellscape like Venezuela, quote for quote. So obviously he was making these inciting statements, and that negligence is still a criminal wrong in itself. Negligence is still something you can prosecute. Secondly, let's talk about your party's legacy. So there are several challenges I want to observe that face the Workers' Party right now in the status quo. I'm then going to go through each of them and talk about how we address them and how this empowers the party, even if the prosecution would happen anyway, and even if the prosecution would be unsuccessful. The first is that there's latent skepticism that exists about the Workers' Party, even though Lula won again. And the reason is because Operation Car Wash, which happened in 2014, saw Lula be accused of a relatively large money laundering scheme through Petrobras, which is the state-owned oil company. Despite the fact that documents came out later showing that this was an attempt to frame Lula to a significant extent, the reason that Lula only won very narrowly is because people were still latently skeptical of the Workers' Party for fear of this kind of crisis again and for fear of corruption ensuing. Secondly, as I already point out, the Workers' Party won on a relatively delicate margin, 50.9%. So you still need to compete against the Liberal Party to a more significant extent. The third thing I want to point out is just gut check. Even though Bolsonaro was barred from running for 8 years, there's still a chance he can run again. And the best proxy we can use for this is actually Lula, because Lula was also barred for running and imprisoned for a significant period of time, but still was able to run again. So I'm going to go through each of these three issues in turn and talk about how we address them. The first is that this significantly dispels narratives that your party is corrupt. Why are people going to be receptive to that messaging and not view you as hypocritical? Firstly, you can capitalize upon the fact that hatred for Bolsonaro is more proximate than Operation Car Wash, which happened in 2014. But secondly, individuals have parasocial relationships with parties in as much as they have lots of political influence. And as you campaign over time on notions of anti-corruption, through advocating for this prosecution, which is the main corruption scandal that's happening right now, younger voters begin over time associating the Workers' Party with notions of fairness and notions of anti-corruption, and notions of Operation Car Wash fade away to a more significant extent. The response to this might be, this happens anyway, which is implicit in LO, but obviously there's a significant margin here. And you want to know why? Because LO hedges the responses to us on there not being a trade-off. So even if they are right and there is not a trade-off, you are spending a lot of time dispelling notions that you are corrupt. What does that mean? You still have the comparative advantage of having lots of really good leftist policies in your platform that people like because of the strong left-wing heritage that exists within Brazil. So you're able to capitalize both on dispelling these narratives around your party that you are corrupt and simultaneously still have your leftist policies. But secondly, you can champion it as a relative win. And the reason for this is that, as we already point out, it's hard to prosecute Bolsonaro for many of the more fucked up things that he did. For instance, the explicitly anti-queer and anti-indigenous policies that he implemented, and the knowledge that people have that he used his power to manipulate the law. But people still really want to see justice be done. So people are likely to view this as an incidental way to hold Bolsonaro and are likely to celebrate it. And as much as lots of these groups like queer people and indigenous people were often disenfranchised from the political system while Bolsonaro was in power. The third thing to point out is that we disempower him, as Muzzy very clearly explains. What's LO's response? Well, he's going to be a martyr. One, they're literally lying about how Bolsonaro played into the Capitol riots. In as much as it's just true that Bolsonaro incited this issue, then it's obviously true that people won't view him as a martyr. But secondly, the question is, who views him as a martyr? Clearly, the people who are going to be on Bolsonaro's side, the 30% at this point, are going to think that he's a martyr on either side of the debate. The differential then becomes the people who notice that this is an issue when it is talked about more in the limelight and associate your party with being one that is against notions of corruption. those are the people who are going to realize that Bolsonaro is bad. So the other thing that they say, and the main push they have, is that individuals will have negative perceptions of your party, particularly moderates. One, this is untrue. Over 55% of people are in support of this prosecution. Number two, again, as I showed, given that he is guilty of this, people are likely to appreciate that. Thirdly, there are rhetorical ways to package your advocacy in ways that don't get people angry. For instance, you can say something obvious like, this generates general deterrence, and that's necessary for us to even have safe politics in the first place. That's necessary for us to even implement the leftist policies that we want to advocate for, because we can't have people in the political system which ruin it. Fourthly, if we prove that you are likely to be prosecuted, then people over time perceive this as the just position, decision. Before we move on, CEO. Great. So how do you weigh this material? One, there is a relatively low threshold for this material to clear in the round. It is not contingent on culpability. It is not contingent on you being correct and being the tipping point for this prosecution happening. It is merely contingent on, one, individuals really hating Bolsonaro, and two, the fact that this dispels negative narratives about your party. And obviously, that's the most proximate interest of your party. Why is that? Because your constituent purpose is to be elected again. So inasmuch as being elected is what enables you to pass the policies that opening opposition talks about, clearly that is the most important interest that you have. But secondly, on culpability, what I already established is that you are both intentful and that you could have done otherwise. Even if they are right that Bolsonaro merely remained silent, that is an act of negligence, and therefore you are still culpable for the Capitol riots that happened. The reason that you as a party care about this principle is because, one, as we point out, and Elo doesn't respond to, you campaign on notions of fairness. You campaign on notions of leftism, on the idea that nobody is above the law. But secondly, this is an actor motion, and this actor is willing to be persuaded by the argument in question. Clearly, this has immense moral weight, in as much as Bolsonaro threatened the very fabric of democracy within Brazil, and therefore party leaders are likely to be really persuaded by the idea that Bolsonaro is indeed criminally culpable.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the deputy leader of the opposition. You're here.
Hi, am I clearly audible?
Yeah, you're clearly audible.
All right. I'll take CG at least once. Before that, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So interestingly enough, the fact TPM didn't take a POI, I think, is quite reflective of OG's engagement in general, which is that I don't think they engage in the comparative. And I'm going to explain what this means. The first thing I want to point out is that they don't actually address any of the pushes that Dennis puts against their case. The most important of which, first of all, is the bargaining chip response. This is really important because if it is so true that publicly calling out Bolsonaro is such a big threat to the right wing, keeping that bullet in the chamber is already enough to win us this debate. Why is this the case? If OG's framing is correct and people are very anti-Bolsonaro, think that the riots were his fault and he's losing support as a result, people like your left-wing policies. It's a bit unclear as to why people will dislike you for not prosecuting Bolsonaro. The reason is you can still prosecute corrupt politicians. You can talk about the issues in the economy that people face on a day-to-day basis that don't affect them in the same way that a riot from a few years ago talked to them. So like if you're a farmer in Brazil or you're working in the manufacturing industry, which by the way is just almost everyone in Brazil works in agribusiness or manufacturing, then presumably what you care the most about is how your life is impacted by the economic policy, whether progressives are going to cut down the forest, like stop you from cutting down forests so you don't earn money. So I don't really understand why this is the most important narrative. But if it is the important narrative, then it's probably important to keep it when you need it for increasingly important political negotiations. But that's not even the most important way to beat opening government, right? There's two things to understand here. The first thing is that the way that Matt characterizes this is that the TSC has banned Bolsonaro from winning, and so the evidence is overwhelmingly against him. The first thing is, I don't do my degree on Brazil, but I do read The Economist and I do read the news, and I'm sure Diego does as well. The TSC voted 3-2 against Bolsonaro. That is 2 judges on TV explaining reasons as to why they don't think Bolsonaro should be jailed. Matt then says 55% of people think you should prosecute Bolsonaro. I don't know if I can't do math, but that is 45% of people who think he shouldn't be prosecuted at all. And of those 55%, we don't know how many of them think Bolsonaro is bad and should be prosecuted at all. What's important here then is that presumably a lot of people still like Bolsonaro, still associate with him and his identity, and the idea that the elite institutions are against Lula. And the obvious reason for this is that what Matt just said, you barely just won. With this framing, it's really important to us to understand what you are risking here. The first thing is, if opening government is correct, you are risking losing the stability you have right now in terms of your moral superiority. If you are so popular, by the way, framing CG cannot randomly throw out of the debate, then presumably you are gaining in power and slowly making compromises and making yourself a consistent political party. If you throw this issue into the mud, you are risking losing that. But second, why will you lose that? First of all, I just want to point out that it makes it really impossible to pass policy in a quite right-wing country, which is that the main issue here is that you're trying to reform the economy, which means convincing unions to vote for your compromises, your reforms, your solutions. What Dennis says is quite important, which is you politicize this issue. It's no longer an issue that people see as a Supreme Court concern. And also, another thing on reading the news, the Supreme Court has publicly already investigated Bolsonaro and asked him to testify. There is a probe investigating him already, and if it concludes that he was responsible, they will prosecute him on both sides. And at that point, once he is prosecuted, I'm very happy for the party to say, fuck that guy. But two things happen. First of all, right-wingers often really dislike this person because if you start attacking Bolsonaro and his rioters and the fact that he incited hatred, you know what you have to focus on? The speeches he gave, the rhetoric he used, the type of things he used to convince people they matter. But unfortunately, that is what got people to vote for him. That is what made people feel like their identities were validated in the first place. The white evangelical Christian farmers on the ground who felt like Bolsonaro was the only person who could protect them. And second of all, the feeling of your free speech being immediately restricted by people from elites. The feeling of using courts to consistently cut down your opportunities to move forward in life. The feeling of a moderate who isn't sure which side is correct, seeing that a political party is pushing for prosecution towards a man who is already being investigated when they have other issues like the economy to focus on, is that this party is distracting from real issues, but more importantly, is attacking the soul of the opposition. And that is important because when this becomes politicized and polarized, the compromises you're making in politics become harder. You're more unlikely to want your representative to work with Lula because he just insulted the person who you respected as a role model because you voted for him and it was a close election. So you don't want that compromise to get through. It makes it difficult to pass policy. And that's the easiest way to lose power. When you can't pass policy in the short term, often people don't think you're an effective government and moderates stop thinking you're worth supporting in the first place. And that's what loses you support in the long term. But second, this distraction from issues that are more salient to people, issues that people care about, is really bad. But third of all, you're going to lose the shouting match. Before I get to why you're probably going to lose the court case, I'll take CG, but I do want to take OG because Matt looks very excited. CG, go. Okay, OG.
It's the opposite. When you cast yourself as anti-corrupt, you're rhetorically able to distance yourself from elitism and capture the voters who previously voted for Bolsonaro. On top of that, obviously politicians can talk about multiple campaign issues. This is just so implausible.
No, wait, but if you talk about multiple issues, then presumably the one that becomes most relevant to voters is the one that gets discussed more at a trade-off, right? And so if you talk about these issues more and people start backlashing more, it takes over your economic issue. So the more pushback you get from the right wing about all the benefits OG is talking about, delegitimizing them, saying that they're criminals, the more you have to defend it and the more you stop talking about economics. But second of all, it's also, and this is the burden Dennis pointed out, you had a chance to fill it and you're a really good debater, so I'm sure you could have, but you didn't. CJ will try to, but they'll probably fail because it's unrealistic. What's more important here is that, you know what's really interesting? If you call Bolsonaro a criminal, you know who else can be called a criminal? Lula, because it's not just car wash that he was involved in. There's also like an entire party that can be accused of corruption. And with enough mudslinging, gaining the high ground is difficult. The issue is that if it's certain, then it's unlikely that this is important because you can keep the bullet in the chamber and continue gaining support. But if it's uncertain, you lose a huge amount of support. Let's weigh the possibilities of the case losing and winning. DPM says the evidence is just overwhelming, in which case, like, this is an assertion, but I'll address it. So incitement is difficult because it's something where you need to intentionally want to cause harm, something Bolsonaro obviously will push against, which will take years of time because court cases don't get resolved in months, which means that the public narrative will be uncertain. If you win the case, it's unlikely unlikely people trust the decision because you were trying to influence the Supreme Court through your political campaign, and it's unlikely they see you as respectable because you were pushing against this prosecution regardless of the evidence. But if you lose the case, he's exonerated and you are insane. You've been pushing against this man for so long and he just got completely owned by the Supreme Court, right? It just loses you a lot of legitimacy. The point is, it's not worth risking it. Like, Diego, look at me. Like, you're doing things fine. Your party's going fine. Why risk all of this, man? Just chill.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the member for the government. Here's here.
Okay, awesome. POIs in chat. I'll get started in a sec. All right. I think it's substantially less important whether or not this conviction actually succeeds than the message it sends about projecting stability long-term within Brazil to people living in the country, as well as to other very important actors internationally. I first want to frame what I think are two big problems facing the Lula administration, explain thoroughly why we think pursuing an intense sort of conviction for Bolsonaro helps us solve those problems. Then lastly, talk about three dimensions of this impact. Firstly, on pursuing a narrative delegitimizing future attempts to undermine democracy. Secondly, securing Brazilian economic investment. And thirdly, helping rehabilitate Brazil's image internationally. First, let's start with some framing. So first of all, Brazil's in a very bad position economically. Bolsonaro was pretty bad for the Brazilian economy. The real substantially dropped after the riot. There's massive lack of investor confidence that stability is going to be something that this is a place I can secure future investments in. And often investors are irrational about this. Africa is heavily underinvested in because people perceive what are often, stable countries like Botswana or Tunisia or Ghana just don't get the amount of investment analogous countries elsewhere get that are similarly unstable. So a lot of this is irrational, but it's very important. And secondly, huge amounts of investors, particularly super rich international ones who are very important, already perceive Lula as an economic risk for Brazil due to his penchant for massive government spending, incurring lots of debt, being a left-wing guy, and often, very economy investors don't really like these kinds of people. Secondly, there's massive perception that Latin America in general is an unstable risk. This is the irrationality part of the analysis coming back into it. There have already been coups in Bolivia and Peru. There's rising authoritarianism in places like Nicaragua. And a lot of people see Lula as very similar to Maduro. And that's not fair. But the point is, big investors see a socialist in Latin America with military coups next door. And they go, that's not a place I want to invest my money in. I'm pulling out. I'm taking my bag of money and I'm going to a different country. Let's explain how you solve this then. Just by pursuing a strong push against Bolsonaro, so say going on television, issuing statements, engaging in this in the national discourse for months and months, for years and years, we're consistently reinforcing the message. Democracy is strong in Brazil. The Brazilian government takes a strong stance at maintaining order. We're not going to allow there to be political instability in our country. This tells this to the world, it tells it to investors, and it tells it to military groups as well as key members within the Brazilian society. DLO argues that this discourse poisons people away and means they don't want to engage with you. I'm pretty sure Lula has a majority in the government, so I'm not clear that this is a huge problem. But even if that's not true, note that we don't have to go about this in a stupid way. We have a monopoly over the state media. We have Lula's massive political clout. So I think we can probably win the discourse coverage over this. But even if not, there are other politicians in Brazil who are on the right wing who are not a Bolsonaro fanatic. Right? There are a lot of people who did not support the coup who would be more than happy to distance themselves from Bolsonaro, especially since, guys, there's an opening to be the right-wing candidate in the next election. So I think a lot of people are going to be happy to go, hey, I'm the not far-right guy, I'm the center-right, a little more moderate than Bolsonaro. I'm happy to reach across the aisle, work with Lula, get stuff done. So I don't think that a lot of DLO's discourse points hold up to scrutiny. So then, given that we can and we will successfully push this narrative that then changes the perceived instability problem in Brazil economically and politically, what are the outcomes of this? Three things. Before I do that, Shaurya, what do you have?
So a party trying to get their opponent arrested is normally considered a pretty authoritarian and undemocratic move, especially if the Supreme Court is independently doing this already. Isn't the UN going to criticize the party for this?
I don't think so, because internationally, Bolsonaro was well known as, I mean, everybody's been comparing him to Trump the entire round. I think that's the average international citizens who's not some like super policy wonk's perception of who Bolsonaro was. They think he's probably a fascist. Whether or not that's true doesn't really matter, because that's how the average global citizen and a lot of governments and probably the UN are going to view it. And again, we control the discourse, so we can make this not in some sort of witch hunt pathological kind of way. Instead, we can say this is about stability, this is about protecting Brazilian democracy. I already think OG's explained why that's probably what's going on here anyways. But let's talk about first how this pushes a strong narrative for future military actors who may want to destabilize Brazil, right? And note one, even if we fail to convict Bolsonaro, setting the message that any future democratic undermining in this country will be pursued to the maximal extent still has this chilling effect on other actors who might want to pursue similar types of behavior. We can also secure subpoenas, which might be really useful in uncovering what connections Bolsonaro may have had in the Secret Service or in the military. This impacts out to being substantially less of a chance of someone trying to engage in democratic undermining. Obviously, as a selfish actor, if I'm very likely to be prosecuted as opposed to marginally likely, it changes my calculus vis-a-vis how much I would like to pursue type of democratic undermining behavior. But secondly, we help secure Brazilian economic rebound. This is really, really important for securing foreign investment and internal economic confidence. You can only get good things like foreign direct investment, people investing in your country, people going, hey, I want to do business here. We're going to give you preferential treatment from the World Bank. We're going to raise your sort of the ranking they give you for how much interest rate you get for international loans. You only get this if investors feel they can get their money back in the future, because there's not going to be a Bolivia-style coup situation, that they feel that there's not going to be some massive crisis in Brazil that completely tanks the economy there. This means that even if you might incur long-term harms, in OO's world, you improve the economy, which means people will want to vote for you. This is the number one issue most people vote on. So you improve the economy by overcoming the short-term sort of COVID-type economic downturn. That means you have better economy long-term, win more elections. Lastly, Lula has a pretty bad position internationally. He's been soft on Russia, which means a lot of people on the West view him with skepticism. I think taking a strong stance on Bolsonaro helps you buck that trend, reverse your international relationship, and substantially improve Brazil's economic and political prospects. Proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I'm going to call upon the member for the position. Here.
Give me one. Just before I give my speech, Ben, just tell me, is the coalition point a separate argument from the legal system? Discord or anywhere? Okay. Okay, I presume that's the case. Starting my speech in 3. Wait, 1 second. My doc is lagging. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In a perfect world, I would also prefer Bolsonaro be prosecuted. But in real life, prosecution or threat of prosecution leads to huge erosion of courts and civilian harms and radicalization. That at this point, the state has a greater obligation to stop those harms from occurring for like lofty blind justice. Few arguments, first on coalition building in Lula's government, secondly on erosion of court, and lastly on civilian harms. First argument then on coalition building in Lula's government. Note that despite winning election, the Workers' Party does not have a majority in the House of Brazil. In fact, as of 2022, it's Bolsonaro's party which has the greatest number of seats by any one party in Congress. Lula's coalition is predicated entirely on a series of moderate parties who share some ideals with Lula's governments on things like creating more robust labor law protections for workers, but has very tenuous support from those parties on other issues such as abortion rights and environmentalism. OG points out that the Labour Party won only by a narrow margin. We add here that their margin isn't just at threat in the next election. Their ability to make policy changes this cycle is directly dependent on their ability to not alienate the moderate parties which make up their coalition. Secondly, I want to talk about which is on erosion of trust in the legal system. In the status quo, a protection is far from guaranteed. The 3-2 vote against Bolsonaro proves that there's a far from a legal consensus on whether or not he is worth personally investigating or not. It is very possible, if not likely, that the outcome of this probe would determine not to criminally prosecute, as it has an even higher burden of proof than being the decision to bar him from running for another election. Second, supporters of populist leaders who create their base on a bigoted scapegoating and cult of personality will never disavow those leaders. We have seen time and again that those who support leaders like Bolsonaro will immediately blame and rapidly adopt conspiracy theories about institutions which seeks to harm those candidates. When Trump was under investigation by the FBI, the Republican Party turned against the FBI, wild about face against an institution they traditionally idolize, right? As Trump has recently been brought to trial in connection to the January 6th election, already the populist segment of the Republican base has begun a series of conspiracy and disinformation campaigns to reduce trust in the court system. Note this is happening before a decision has ever been made. Whether Trump is found guilty or not, damage has been done. Bolsonaro is not an unpopular politician. He has significant following, meaning that an attempt to leverage the legal system against him will ultimately and necessarily undermine trust in the courts across the entire country. Why does this matter? Because the courts are crucial for three things. First, the courts are critical for holding legislature accountable writ large. There are many individual legislature and citizens who lack the countrywide support and culture of personality that Bolsonaro does, who the courts can hold accountable to anti-corruption standards with relatively lesser scrutiny. Second, the court are critical for upholding legislation that constitutes the basis of Lula's platform. In addition to anti-corruption law, Lula is also pushing labor protection laws and environmental protection laws. The courts will be required to defend those laws over and over again for the next several decades in order to ensure the precedent is built to protect those laws in the future. So does this translate to an impact? Let's discuss the politicization of the court. OO says it looks like we are politicizing the court. Importantly, we're saying you cause the politicization of the court when you do this. When suppose corruption in the court becomes a politically salient ideal for the next several election cycles, you're giving conservatives a platform to run on fighting corruption in the court, an action which would otherwise. First, the huge problem here is that we provide clout or cover for packing upper courts with partisan judges in the name of fighting corruption. And note that even if the courts are not completely packed with conservative judges, we increase the polarization of the courts. This means that we're much less likely to create stable and adjudicable precedent by which to enforce these laws into the future. In other words, as a direct result of prioritizing a frivolous lawsuit which is unlikely to succeed in the first place, you make any policy progress Lula might make necessarily more vulnerable in the long term. Third argument on civilian harms. I want to be clear on why civilian harms does not occur on our side of the house, POI in the chat. The context here is that we all know that Bolsonaro is not going to run for presidency till 2030 cost limitations. This means practically two things. The first thing is he literally doesn't have a national platform to incite any violence, in which case he does under op, because there's going to be a huge media coverage the moment he's prosecuted and everyone will be focusing on him. So whatever shit he say is going to be broadcasted to everyone in the country. But secondly, notably, Bolsonaro is literally 68 right now. Like, he's a grandpa, meaning that he can't run for office again after like 2030, right? Importantly, Bolsonaro dies out in the long term on our side of the house because media is not going to cover him anymore, and he doesn't have the same magnitude of platform to like bullshit. The problem why government creates a space where Bolsonaro can radicalize voters into violence is a few-fold. But importantly, before the reasoning, I think that it's important to note again that Bolsonaro specifically operates under a cult of personality. This means that O is quite correct in pointing out that 45% still support Bolsonaro, and those voters idolize him. It's not just supporting them, but idolize him, making his rhetoric exponentially more powerful. This means the cyclical effects where people will try to sway, for example, their families and friends all in favor of Bolsonaro because they will go far more for Bolsonaro because they idolize him than any other politician they support, right? So why do people get radicalized? 3 reasons, actually 2 maybe. First, that this gives him a huge edge and national attention to galvanize people. He will have a wider reach of audience to possibly sway moderate voters to his side per his strong cultural personality and his voter passion to rally around him. I think importantly, OG tries to say here that people love laws and orders. But again, cult of personality is strictly irrational. Using powerful rhetorics like the election is fake makes people fear and uncomfortable. This is more powerful than just laws and justice when it's more abstract in nature. You're pulling the strings of the emotions of people by using very, very strong rhetorics, and your families and friends are all in support of Bolsonaro, right? Secondly, Bolsonaro can use this prosecution as a justification for violence. He can frame this as an attack on democracy, as an attack on himself. You increase the options he can incite violence in his toolbox, right? Sympathy is an extremely powerful emotion to manipulate with. And I think what is Bolsonaro gonna ask people to do? He's probably gonna ask for people to commit violence because chaos is, if anything, the best way to get him possibly out of jail and out of prosecution, given that everyone is committing violence and the country is chaotic, right? So who actually gets harm in this scenario? The most direct harm in this scenario is just people in your party, in your own party, right? Because insofar as you as the party are representing the voters' bases below you, is leashing out a stance into the public, people will presume that your followers also agree with you. So your voter base who doesn't want to get affiliated with this necessarily have to confront Bolsonaro supporters and get verbally abused by they criticizing your political ideal, best case scenario. But everything Bolsonaro supporters have done in the past, which is violence when he lost the elections, are probably going to reoccur again, because it's another point that Bolsonaro is publicly shamed to some public prosecution. Aside from just the sheer number of suffering, I think as a party you probably have a principal obligation to not harm your direct voters, right? But secondly, this probably causes collateral damage to innocent people that isn't politically involved, like destroying a hospital or robbing a store simply just ruins everyone's life across the country, on the basis that I'm very happy to oppose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the government whip. Here.
Brilliant. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, exceptional. I'm going to start by taking CO out of the round, then reframe it, explicitly stating what the actual extension is coming out of CG, and then weighing that against all themes in the debate. Okay, firstly, onto CO. CO brings us a really weird extension. First, onto their point about the coalition. Notably, all of the members of the coalition formed as an anti-Bolsonaro coalition, right? The people who they were able to form a coalition in terms of stopping Bolsonaro from taking power. And so likely the coalition is anti-Bolsonaro, and you're unlikely to alienate the majority of coalition or any of the coalition members, because none of them are backed or part of the Bolsonaro coalition. So at the point at which you have anti-Bolsonaro rhetoric, it's unclear whether this is meaningfully going to harm your ability to work within coalition members, given that their entire purpose of this coalition was to oust Bolsonaro. So that just doesn't make any sense. The second is this, same incentives for the PT to prosecute Bolsonaro also apply for coalition members. So if you buy any of the Gov analysis about stability or positive signaling about anti-corruption, it probably applies if the PT has an incentive to pursue prosecution, presumably also the coalition members do, because they accrue the same electoral benefits from it. Secondly, about cults of personality. Basically, they run very similar material to OO, that there's going to be negative backlash, and it's going to lead to a ton of harms because it will look like the court is politicized. The first thing important to note is that the people who support Bolsonaro are already skeptical of the electoral system. They literally attempted a fucking coup, right? The premise of Bolsonaro's rhetoric and the people who still support Bolsonaro, even after his supporters and his rhetoric led to people armed storming the Capitol, are people who presumably don't believe in the legitimacy of the Lula regime and don't believe in the electoral process. So at the point at which they are likely to be and have animosity towards towards Lula, it's unclear why this is uniquely the tipping point, given that Bolsonaro's entire rhetoric has historically been anti-Lula, that this government is illegitimate. It's unclear why this is going to be such a dramatic tipping point in terms of taking action, given the current perceptions. Secondly, it's not comparative. The court already ruled against Bolsonaro. So if they believe the court is like biased or the court is like politicized, presumably that's already happened, right? They already see that they barred him from election. All of the material about this looking super politicized or super slimy is something that's already happened. The tipping point in this debate is whether or not the Lula government comes out and says, this is something I agree we should be doing, versus them making no comment, right? The prosecution has already happened, so the perceptions of the court is unlikely to be a tipping point in this debate. Thirdly, like the incentive to pack the court already exists, right? There are safeguards about this in the Brazilian constitution. Conservatives already want to pack the courts. Bolsonaro already had an incentive to do this. It's not like they're going to do it even harder, given that there are structural like mechanisms. This is the reason why the Brazilian Supreme Court, despite having massive corruption in Brazil, is actually freer and fairer than the United States court based on the structural mechanism. So it's unclear how you actually achieve politicizing or stacking the court, which is the only impact of this argument. Finally, like given that you aren't going to have packing of the court, it's unclear why like perceiving the court as politicized is super important, right? People already don't trust the process who are Bolsonaro supporters. So if they don't like the courts, I guess they can just be like, I don't like these courts. But it's something I already agree with, given the court has already ruled against Bolsonaro. Finally, civilian harms, right? You can impose gag orders on prosecutions. So if Bolsonaro is being prosecuted, you can say, hey, you can't speak out against this. This is what judges have imposed on Trump, right? You can limit the ability of him to use rhetoric or talk about this prosecution as it's ongoing. That's something courts are likely to do if, as CO said, this might be a risk. But two, it's not just about signaling to Bolsonaro or stopping him from running, but it's signaling to other right-wing populists, as Diggory uniquely tells you, that if you attempt a coup or if you attempt to undermine the electoral process, you will go to jail and we will prosecute you. That's the most important thing in this round about signaling, because Bolsonaro, as everyone points out, is not really a risk in and of himself in future elections, but it's other right-wing populists who will attempt the same rhetoric more aggressively because they saw that if you don't like advocate for this, then you're unlikely to go for like you're going to be unscathed. And if you live in OO's world, that people are more in favor of civility politics than actually tackling people who undermine the legitimacy and stability of the Brazilian election. Okay, let's talk about what we get uniquely and why it's so important that you advocate for this specifically. And I want to frame just very at the top that a lot of Brazilian electors have lived in a military dictatorship. The Brazilian military dictatorship ended in 1985. People have lived under military dictatorships, seen military juntas take power in the country, and so it is likely something that a lot of voters care about or fear in terms of the decision making. Okay, why is advocating uniquely so important? One, you get media attention on specifically signaling that you are tackling coups. It looks like the Brazilian government or the Lula government coming out and saying, this is something we care about. We care very much about the stability of our government. We are concerned about this and we are likely to take action. Secondly, that your advocacy doesn't look like you're supporting a specific outcome, right? It doesn't need to look like, as no OPNI team engages with, we're going to throw Lula in prison. It looks like we will think that the prosecution should happen. If there is any risk at all that Bolsonaro was culpable, that should be investigated, and if he is culpable, thrown in prison. We think that it's uniquely important that investigating Bolsonaro has subpoenas involved with it, that you can find information that prosecuting him on the comparative never gets. And given that there is a lot of uncertainty, was the military involved in this coup? Was the Secret Service involved in the coup? We think that not answering these questions through the prosecution can lead to greater uncertainty about the future stability of the country or the relationship or stability of the military in that country and the ability for that country to remain free. Finally, it signals to future right-wingers that this is likely to lead to coups in the future. Like if you attempt a coup, we'll throw you in prison, and that will be super harmful. Like you have to signal to future people, because if you don't, that signaling doesn't exist and more people are likely to try it. Sure, I'll take OO.
Yeah. So the best way to get the international community to trust you or fix the economy is to be able to pass policies that to pass policies, right?
Yeah, okay, dope. So our case, I'll now jump into weighing against OO, right? Our case directly deals with this because Diggory tells you that in status quo, right after the coup happened, the value of the Brazilian real plummeted. Investors pulled out of that country out of fear. So at the point at which it looks like you aren't seriously tackling stability in the country, investors will never come into you in the first place, and your ability to pass economic policy is deeply stunted. And two, electoral incentives, and this flips is a prerequisite to OG's material because presumably voters care more about stability and the economy than they care about Bolsonaro and democracy. And so at the point at which stability and signaling stability is a prerequisite to get the necessary economic policy or have a stable economy and currency in the long run, we think that the only mechanism to do that is to signal that you care about stability. This is why we outweigh OG in this debate, because OG talks about maybe you get elected and maybe that allows you to pass policies. We tell you, A, that stability is a more important electoral issue, but two, that your ability to pass policies is fundamentally threshold by the degree of perception of stability and the point at which you signal that we don't actually care about attempted coups. People aren't able to invest in your country, and the ability for you to pass your agenda is fundamentally stunted. Finally, just weighing OO very, very quickly, we think, A, it's unclear why, we tell you, similar for CO, where the prosecution being compared is not super relevant, but two, Bolsonaro has already poisoned the well. So their argument about Bolsonaro go hard on you now, Bolsonaro has already delegitimized the Lula government, so it's unclear why prosecuting him is going to make him use any more inflammatory rhetoric, given that he's used literally the most inflammatory rhetoric already. So proud to propose.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. And now I would like to call upon the opposition whip. You're here.
Thank you, thank you. Just 1 second while I grab my timer. First things first, let's talk about the status quo. Let's make sure that we're on the same page for characterization going into adjudication. First, the country is more or less 50-50 on whether or not Bolsonaro should even be prosecuted to begin with. That projection is likely even more dire when we consider how many of the people who believe that he should be prosecuted actually believe that ultimately he will be guilty. A question like that very likely to include people who believe that he ought to be prosecuted in order to exonerate him. And so it's unlikely that the political sentiments of the country reflect anything close to what opening government very optimistically characterized it as. Second, the panel that barred Bolsonaro from running until 2030, as was mentioned, did so on a 3-2 split decision. Every debater in the room knows that doesn't feel great. Third, what this means is that there is no guarantee that current probes will lead to criminal investigation of Bolsonaro at all. It is also very possible that political pressure from Lula's party will force the court's hand in terms of prosecuting Bolsonaro. We're actually willing to bite the idea that the pressure here may be the tipping point, and we're going to argue that that's a bad thing. Note that opening government is dead wrong that on most of their characterization, the case is not a sure thing. Even barring him from running for election was not a sure thing, let alone putting the guy in prison. The support for his prosecution is tenuous at best, and there are many, many people who have very strongly, actively opposed such a decision. Ultimately, we agree with opening op's characterization that the case is extremely unlikely to be won, and would add that it's unlikely to even happen in the first place. Before I move on, I'll take opening government, and to allay any concerns, I will also take CG.
So both you and DLO dropped the very obvious response that the Workers' Party will package this in a very smart way. For instance, we are anti-corruption, so your welfare money doesn't get siphoned off.
Right. So I'm going to talk about why anti-corruption as a basis for platform is uniquely unstrategic as a piece of rebuttal to closing government's material in a bit. So when I do that, note that it's flagged as an answer to this POI as well. So what does all of this context that I've built for you mean for closing government's case? They talk about three things. First, on economic outcomes for Brazil. We say that policy passage is a priori. If Lula cannot implement economic policy change to reverse the damage Bolsonaro has done, Brazil's economy will not recover with any speed. They try to overcome this by talking about investor confidence. I'll get there in a second. This means that anything done to disrupt the Workers' Party's fragile coalition is a stronger link to lack of investor confidence than whether or not Bolsonaro is prosecuted. Now, something really important that needs to be said here. They tried to gut check you and say that this coalition was founded on anti-Bolsonaro sentiment, and so then any action taken against Bolsonaro is likely to be one that that any member of the coalition will support. A couple critical things here. First of all, a coalition founded on beating Bolsonaro in the general election and Bolsonaro's party in Congress is very different from a coalition which supports actively antagonizing and riling up Bolsonaro's base in a way that is easily avoidable and also easily predictable. Then second, given that information, the context Chris added for you is critical here, that the political climate has already shifted back in Bolsonaro's favor since the 2020 elections. Bolsonaro's party regained up to, I believe, just under 100 seats, the single largest party representation in the Brazilian Congress in the 2022 election. What does this combination of facts mean? It means that the moderate parties, which Lula's party has formed a coalition with bandwidth in Congress in order to pass any kind of policy is visibly fragile. It means that they are under threat in a way that they weren't necessarily in 2020. And even in 2020, the election was rather close. So what does this mean? It means that the majority of the moderate coalition parties, which are currently aligned with Lula's party, want to leave well enough alone. Advocacy is not there from those parties for the prosecution of Lula because they know that ultimately what it does is threaten the stability of their own party's position in Congress. This means that those moderates who are theoretically anti-Bolsonaro are still going to be alienated by an active and aggressive push towards criminal prosecution when most people and many people in the country believe that barring him from re-election was enough. Second, the risk of losing the case represents a greater threat to investor confidence than a successful prosecution would be a boon to investor confidence. So let me explain. Given that Bolsonaro has already been barred from running, given that the riots failed, and many people who were involved in the riots have been held criminally liable and will continue to do so, the best thing to do now for international economics is to let the dust settle, let investors take comfort in the fact that he has been relatively deplatformed, and understand that those consequences also have a chilling effect, even if they are not criminal penalties. So in other words, we have a path forward to returning and regaining investor confidence, which is to let the actions that we have taken be enough. However, losing has the opposite effect in a much more powerful way. It means that we take the current narrative, which is that Bolsonaro was punished, he's not allowed to rerun for election, and we change that narrative immediately in all of the political discourse and all of the international conversation becomes how the court failed to successfully prosecute Bolsonaro for this crime. Whether or not the effect on Bolsonaro is the same, he's in prison or not, it's about how we take advantage of media cycles and what the dominant narrative is relative to Bolsonaro's platforming and success in the country. Closing government.
Him being charged is independent of our benefits. Backing this prosecution, regardless of outcome, gives certainty about the culpability and risk of future coups. If he's exonerated, that's fine, because we don't have any fear about potential future right-wing coups or his relationship to the military.
Hold on, I'm sorry. You're trying to tell me that if the guy incites a coup, gets criminally prosecuted, and is exonerated, that's going to act as a deterrent against future people doing the same thing? That's nonsense. We have inflicted visible consequences on him. Let that be the narrative. That is the chilling effect. You only risk undermining it, and that is what is so critical here. Then they say our point on the courts is non-comparative. They say that like the sliminess of the court has already been proven. Here's the point. Lula is uniquely vulnerable when being aggressive on anti-corruption. They say that people won't view anti-corruption legislation as hypocritical because car wash is less proximate, but they pointed to that same scandal as the principal reason why the election was close in the first place. Clearly, it's proximate enough. If I'm running against the Workers' Party and they decide to prosecute and have this be the basis for their platform going forward, I am turning all of my political talking points to Lula is corrupt instead. Corruption becomes the name of the election cycle. The courts become the focal point of the election cycle, and whether or not the courts are slimy or not, are corrupt or not, become the point of the election cycle. And unfortunately, asserting that Brazil's constitution is so thorough as to make it impossible to pack the courts is not enough in the government whip. Clearly, it is plausible. If it is harder there than it is in the United States, then what we cannot afford to do is give them all the smoke cover in the world to run their own anti-corruption campaign against the courts, delegitimize them, and erode the effectiveness of those courts in upholding legislation in the long term.
Thank you very much for that fine speech. Thank you all for this debate. This is a silent round, so you can look up for me after the break. And I hope you have fun. So see you later.
Thank you very much, everybody.
For judging. Thanks everyone for a fun round.
Thanks, everyone.